Hello, my name is Andrew Keene. Welcome to Keene on America, the daily interview show about the United States. Hello, everybody. It doesn't matter when you look at the headlines. It's always the same story in a way. Violence. Everywhere in the world, there's violence. It's like a contagion. It doesn't matter whether it's the violence associated with the American invasion of Iran, violence in Africa as we speak. There are explosions and gunfire as arms groups launch coordinated attacks across Mali. Violence associated with bombs, violence, even personal violence, human-on-human violence associated with murder. It is indeed like an epidemic. And my guest today actually treats violence in the world as if it was an infectious disease. He's a doctor, and he used to study and fight against infectious disease. And now he's shifted his attention and treats violence as a kind of infectious disease. His name is Dr. Gary Slutkin. He founded an organization called Cure Violence Global, and he has a new book out. It's called The End of Violence, Eliminating the World's Most Dangerous Epidemic, and he's joining us from San Francisco, up the road from me on the coast, the city of love. Gary, some people might look at this book and your work and think, well, it's all very noble, but why is it an epidemic? Isn't it natural to humans? We've spent our entire history as a species fighting one another. Is that wrong?
Well, we have, as a species, a long history of it, but it isn't in every place. It's not a human universal. And in so many places, we've been able to be rid of it, or almost rid of it. In fact, we have a lot of experience, even in communities that our organization has worked in, to reduce it to even zero for a year to 3 years. But if you look at the difference between countries, and if you look over history, what you really see is it coming and going. And in other words, behaving like an epidemic, like other diseases or pandemics, even like plague or cholera, which in many cases we've put into the past. So there's a lot of, no, it's not a human universal at all. It's just something that arises when people pick it up from each other, like for other contagious or infectious diseases. And until we get a handle on it and interrupt its spread, it continues to spread. But when we do the right things and cool it down, and especially when we now have an opportunity to re-understand it, not as a matter of bad people, but as a matter of an epidemic health issue, then we see that, in fact, violence has been misdiagnosed. And it's this misdiagnosis that has caused us to not be able to control it as we could.
Gary, is violence rational? The great 17th century English writer Thomas Hobbes, who, of course, in his Leviathan spoke of the state of nature as one of war of all against all, a war of all against all, suggested that there was an element of reason to violence, but we don't want violence. Is there something rational or irrational about violence, or are those the wrong words to use to describe it?
Well, there's so much to say about this. I mean, violence behaves in a predictable way according to how much you've been exposed to it, how much you think that it's expected of you, and what your susceptibility is. So it's like, is COVID rational, or is cholera rational, or is measles rational? It's behaving instead through an operating system of how much you are around others who have it. So, but what happens as we operate mentally, even if we've copied it and we're susceptible to it because of grievance or humiliation or whatever, we put in an explanation after the fact. But the principal way, and this is what the End of Violence book explains and describes, is the way that it's actually interacting with us. And this is historical to have this new realization, is that the more you're exposed, the more likely you are to be infected. Same for measles, same for COVID, same for plague, same for anything. The more you're exposed to, the more it's in your community, the more it's in your home, the more you're exposed to it, even through media or through even an infected leader who is spraying it around. That is the predictor of whether you're more likely to do it. And then there's other variables, as there are for other contagious phenomenon, as to whether you have an immune response to it or not.
Gary, your book comes with a very nice blurb from Steven Pinker. He says, Gary Slutkin is one of the most important thinkers and activists in the vital effort to understand and reduce violence. Pinker, of course, is well known, in some ways quite controversial, for arguing that the history, or certainly the modern history of humanity, is one of a reduction of violence. Is in your view, is he right? Is Pinker right to suggest that that there's less violence today, perhaps in 2026, than there was in 1926 or 1826? In other words, is the epidemic in retreat?
Well, what any of our viewers can look at, and this is by just Googling the waves of violence over time, or even looking in Steven Pinker's book, or in, what really struck me when I was coming back from working on other infectious diseases and began to look at the curves of violence, is that violence comes and goes. And the coming and going of violence it occurs in waves. That's the standard epidemic wave of rising and then peaking and then coming down. If you look at the waves of smallpox over the last 100 years before it was eliminated and in fact eradicated, and if you look at the waves of violence in the United States or even the world over the last few centuries, you see these curves that go like this, the behavior of an epidemic. So if you take any moment, like right now, we have a pandemic in a not so early phase with epicenters in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, in the Gulf, around Iran, in Israel, Gaza, multiple hotspots, or what we call epicenters, in epidemiology and in public health throughout Africa, as well as in Central America. And some of these are growing quite a bit right now. I mean, we all are seeing this, and we're seeing the spread. So there isn't a simple question to this. It's really a matter of whether we can put into place in each of these hotspots enough of the correct approaches and interventions that reduce it, as we have for many other contagious diseases, and as we have also for violence. I mean, or let me just add this about the United States right now. There's over a dozen cities in the United States that are at 50 or 60-year lows, or at historic lows. And that isn't a coincidence. That's a result of the epidemic control approach being applied, part of it or all of it, some of it, and the funding of epidemic control in the form of interrupters, in the form of community responses, basically the epidemic control playbook, going by dozens, maybe even hundreds of names now. So, reverting back to your question about Steven Pinker, who is himself one of the greatest thinkers on many things, including violence, the trends come and go, and as they do for other epidemics. If you look at TB right now or AIDS, you're seeing it going down very consistently, although there are some relapses going on now because some of the approaches, as a result of the foreign AIDS cuts, are causing upticks. So there's several things within this answer. One is violence behaves exactly like an epidemic disease. In fact, it meets the definition of disease. It meets the definition of contagious. Characteristic signs and symptoms causing morbidity and mortality. Not a definition of disease I wrote. Morbidity and mortality just means disability and death. Contagious means it causes more of itself. And you want to look at causing more of itself, look at what's happening in Iran right now. In and around it in this period. One event leading to more of it. Look what happens in a community. Look what happens in a home. One event leading to another.
Let's use the example of America. You talked about the reduction of violence in many American cities, but the current administration seems to play on many Americans, not all Americans, but many Americans' paranoia about violence. And in fact, one of the reasons it would seem as if the current president was elected was because of people's fear of violence. So is that a form of violence, Gary, to play on people's paranoia about violence? And would that explain perhaps the behavior of ICE or what's happening now in Iran?
Yeah, there's a lot in that question too, Andrew, thanks. So let's start with what is the definition of violence. It is the use of threat or power or force. So to cause intentionally physical injury or even deprivation and even psychological injury. So, to the current administration or to any authoritarian type disorder, what you see is violence coming from it in multiple directions. So the war in Iran is part of the work of authoritarianism. And so it isn't just a war, it's authoritarianism causing war. And likewise within the state, not just outside the state, but within the state, as you mentioned. So violence being done into communities, you mentioned ICE, and also the provocation of others, not just within the government, of others, giving the approval, and in fact, sometimes the signals or even the scripts of doing violence. This is what the book reveals in Chapter 8. Chapter 8 is called Infections of the State. Within this chapter is something which we're calling authoritarian violence disorder. So as you've pointed out in the introduction, there are many types of violence. There's the mass shootings, there's violence in the home, there's violence, there's child abuse, but there's also a violence of the state. And it shows up by violence to the population and outside the population. But just this one last point into this part of our conversation, diseases don't know borders. They go where they go. And they don't start with a person. They continue through us, the way COVID does, the way plague used to, the way measles didn't, but now it does in this country. It works its way into who is proximate, who is close. It can be physically close, or it can be socially close, or felt close. And then who is susceptible. And some of this, pointing to other people as who have grievances, that their grievances are more, increases their susceptibility. We learned about exposure and susceptibility with COVID. The closer someone is to you who has COVID, the closer someone is to you who has measles, the more likely you are to get it. Same for violence in your home, in your community, how close you feel to, let's say, an authoritarian leader, how close you feel. Because the brain works through not only physical, but also felt proximity. So that's exposure. And then the other way all contagious and infectious diseases work is, given that exposure, are you likely, because some of us have had that exposure, are you more likely to then really get the full-blown syndrome and then do it yourself? And that relates to your vulnerability, your susceptibility. With COVID, we learned that it had to do with metabolic problems or age. But for violence, that susceptibility has to do with how much you feel humiliated, you feel pain, you feel grievance, social pain. And a lot of the country does. But a leader can make your pain feel worse and can make you feel that those people are to blame for it. So that's the way this works. It works on its own through our brains, the way the COVID works through the respiratory system, the way the cholera works in the intestinal system. It works like that, just like a contagious disease. And that's how, when we know that and we understand that, we then say, that's good news. Because now we know how to manage epidemics. We know how to do it. We're not blaming people. We're not judging people. We're not overly punishing people. We're now interrupting its spread.
Gary, I want to come to the cures after the break, but a couple of quick questions. Firstly, how does your theory, because of course it is a theory of violence, how would it explain mass murderers, Ted Bundy, people, especially men who go around murdering many people, sometimes in communities which are actually relatively peaceful? I mean, is there an element of chance there, just as some people catch COVID or some people caught COVID with just one freak experience? It's not always as rational or as scientific as we would hope, is it?
So let me just take the first sentence you said. So in science, a theory is not hypothetical. Like, we have something called germ theory. We have something called evolution theory, or quantum theory. So this is that kind of a full shift into the best descriptor of the process itself. So that to the other part of what you're asking, which is so important, some of these people who are, in a way, mass murderers, and this isn't just one person. Sometimes this is mass murder can occur from a country leader, as we saw in World War I and World War II, or a few such leaders, where such things happen through their followers or through obedience. But for these isolated cases with names such as these, some of them are people who have very, very bad childhoods. I mean, so child abuse leads to this. I mean, we looked at there's this African proverb, which leads one of the chapters actually on susceptibility, is that the child who's not embraced by the village will then want to destroy the whole village. So this kind of pain and the need to get out of that pain. So there's a pain center and there's a get out of pain center, which is largely dopamine, which is largely insatiable and goes to cruelty and destructiveness to scale. That's the reason for a number of these. If we look at their histories, a rare case is there of someone with, who didn't have that kind of a background.
Gary, final question before the break. You said intriguingly that, and I think this makes a lot of sense in terms of at least your thesis, that diseases don't know borders. Where does your border in terms of defining violence end when it comes to the self? What about violence against the self? I mean, it goes without saying people sometimes cut their wrists or commit suicide. But what about people who, at least according to psychologists, spend their life abusing themselves, making themselves miserable, blaming themselves? Is your thesis in the end of violence that we can also eliminate self-harm?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in fact, there have been a lot of projects and interventions to reach out to people. It's the same playbook, detecting and interrupting a potential event. That's what's done in the community by Cure Violence and by other community interventions, and also by hotlines or people who in the neighborhood or friends or family who will know someone who is thinking about it, to detect, a word we use, and to offer them some kind of connection and buying some time, cooling them down, and helping them get out of it. But let me just add that suicide is one of the 10 or 12 syndromes. In fact, exposure to any of the types, child abuse, community violence, violence in the home, war is likely causes suicide to be more likely, as suicide itself has been shown to be contagious. And we see clusters of suicide after Marilyn Monroe, after any that's publicized. Let me just add one more thing. These mass shooters are large. It's an overlap with suicide. About 70% of mass murder as mass shootings are done by people who either have suicidality, or were intending to have or expecting to die in the event. And more in the majority of them do. So these are overlapping syndromes, from war to suicide to you name it.
Yeah, it's interesting. The more I talk to you, I'm sure you're familiar with Camus' 1947 novel, The Plague, which of course is extremely metaphorical. It became a fashionable book to reread during COVID. But of course, what Camus was talking about, I think, was a broader kind of plague of violence. There was a central doctor, Dr. Ryu, in it. And in some ways, I'm guessing, Gary, do you kind of model yourself on guys like Ryu?
I don't think I remember enough about that.
Well, maybe reread the book. We are speaking with Gary Slutkin, MD, the author of The End of Violence, a fascinating, very controversial thesis that presents violence as a kind of epidemic, means that we can end it. We're going to talk about solutions, ways of ending violence, perhaps in a medical sense, after the break. But I'm going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with Gary Slutkin, MD, the author of End of Violence. Don't go away, anyone. This is not a commercial break. That's because we don't have commercials on this show. I'm not going to waste your time trying to sell you inane products. However, I do have a pretty good deal for you. I'm writing a book about the United States. It's due out in 2028. And if you become a paid subscriber on my Keen on America Substack, you'll not only get very cool notes and photographs and videos from this project, but I'll also send you a personalized signed copy of the book when it comes out in 2028. So go to keenon.substack.com and become a paid subscriber. That's keenon.substack.com. And now back to our conversation. We're speaking with Gary Slutkin, MD, the author of The End of Violence. He has a fascinating thesis in the book and in his life, I guess, that violence is a contagious disease. He spent much of his life as an I'm not going to even try and pronounce that word, a guy who fights against epidemics as a doctor. So, Gary, I know you've written a number of academic papers on all this, and as I said, you founded a group called Cure Violence Global. Where do we begin to cure it? Where do we begin to address violence as you seem to be suggesting, it's like COVID or like cancer?
Not like cancer, more like measles or flu or cholera or plague.
Okay, so it's not an illness; it's a contagious disease.
Yeah, it's a contagious disease, disorder, or illness. It's contagious. Cancers, I mean, some of them arise out of contagious diseases, but for the most part, I'm talking about contagious diseases. The way to begin is the same way that you begin, the same way that I learned to begin when I was running the tuberculosis program for San Francisco, when I was working with cholera in Somalia, and when we were setting up the global program on AIDS for Uganda and the other countries. The exact same playbook. You map it out, you look where the hot spots are, you find out where spread is occurring now. So you start with that. Then you need to hire a group of people and develop a system around this group of people who can look at those hotspots, hire people from those hotspots to then interact with where the spread is going on to stop the further spread. And then there's a whole bunch of other aspects to it. It's very hard to, but the book, especially in chapter 6, which is called Interruption of Spread, and chapter 7, which shows about norms and the system to set up to do this, which Cure Violence has been doing for 25 years, is that in a community, we'll just look at community violence now, there are people who are thinking about doing a shooting. And there have been people who are hired because they have access to those people. They are from the same group, they grew up together. They trust each other. And these people, which are now called violence interrupters, which became a new category of worker for the world, which there's thousands of them now, maybe tens of thousands. These workers then approach those people, and they're already known by them. And they're talking about, what are you thinking of doing? What are you thinking about? And then there will be a conversation, which could be full of all kinds of swearing, shift their perspective to where they now can not do that shooting and still feel physically safe and socially safe among their peers. At the same time, if this is two groups, or you could say two countries, or you could say this is a potential mass shooter or whatever, at the same time, you're now helping that person save face among his peers. And that may mean that it's usually he, because 85 to 95% of this disorder is one of men and boys. They now can feel that they're let off the hook. They feel that they have saved face because of an explanation they can give, that it wasn't worth it, or that this was a mistake, or this guy didn't mean it, or that they're more afraid anyway. And then on the other side, the same thing is happening, is that there's a violence interrupter or more cooling people down. And so that the matter is settled, the violence didn't happen, there's no more shootings going on in that area. Everyone is still connected with. And as a result of this kind of activity, we have had about 20 studies and in about 60 countries, 60 cities in 20 countries experience where 40 to 70% drops are common, where 80 to 90% drops have occurred multiple times, including even in Mexico and Colombia and Honduras, as well as in New York City and Baltimore and Chicago, and where about 25 communities, it's probably way more than that, that's just what we know about, have gone to zero.
Gary, this is all very intriguing, but I wonder whether there's one step before that in terms of ending violence. I'm guessing, I mean, you've got some very heavy hitters supporting your book and your work, including, as I said, Steven Pinker and Nicholas Kristof, the New York Times writer. But is there a step before this? Do you need to convince people like myself, my audience, people who are not familiar with your work, or even with any sort of scientific understanding of epidemics, as well as, of course, political figures, that violence is an epidemic? I mean, you obviously have your thesis. Some people might scratch their head and think, well, that's kind of weird. I've never thought of it like that. Other people might argue against you. What's your experience of presenting this argument to the world?
That's such an important question. So not everybody wants to see it that way, because we as a society are very judgmental, and we want to see people who are doing this as bad. Our frame of this is moralism. That was the same frame that we had for leprosy and plague and typhus and typhoid. And we would put these people in dungeons. We put the widow down a well, all kinds of crazy things, because we didn't understand it. Those things were a little bit easier to re-understand because they were affecting, the lungs or the intestines. But when we figured them out, we developed new strategies, and that's why we hardly even think about these other problems that I just mentioned, because we put them in the past. So it was re-understanding them that was important to make the shift in strategy and to make the progress. It was very hard for people to believe and accept that the earth goes around the sun. We just don't see it that way. Or even that evolution has occurred. So it's similar to that, because it's not our everyday experience or the way our mind works. But it's not only scientifically, because I could see scientifically 25 years ago that violence was behaving this way. But what we started to do, and the reason why I founded this organization, was to prove that treating it this way worked. And it works better than anything that, I never said that there wasn't anything else, but it works. Went 3 times in Chicago when the funding for this was dropped, it went back up, and there wasn't anything else that the government had or that anybody else had. So it's the right thing because of the science, and because we were able to demonstrate that treating it in this way works repeatedly. Chicago, Baltimore, New York, Des Moines, Detroit, North Carolina, Los Angeles, Honduras, San Pedro Sula was the most violent city in the world in 2014. It had 10 times the rate of killings of Chicago. Not twice, 10 times. And with this really strong team, the Latin American team of Cure Violence, it was dropped 90%. Killings were dropped 90% in the first 2 years. That city now is like number 43, not the first. And it has maintained the 79% drop. Similarly, in Cali, Colombia, not in the whole city in Cali, San Pedro Sula is the whole city, but in communities in Mexico, Colombia, and we've shown interruption also in conflict zones in Iraq and in Syria during a war. So, in the notes to the epilogue of the book, The End of Violence, is I spent a lot of time on this. I looked at the different types, what I call syndromes, because they're all one problem that bleeds into each other. Every single one of them has solutions. Child abuse, violence in the family, political violence, war. Every single one of them has solutions if you look hard enough. World Health has information on this. CDC previously had information on this, as did many academic groups. But if you look really hard at what caused it, the reduction, it was an epidemic control approach.
Gary, you believe, it is obvious, that violence is a contagious disease. You're a doctor. Historically, you were a doctor of contagious diseases. You've written all sorts of scientific papers on this. Your website's full of them. What's been the response of the scientific community? Is there a debate now going on amongst scientists? I'm assuming that not all experts on contagious diseases believe that violence is the equivalent of AIDS or COVID.
You know, this is, I love this question too, because so I posed this question. So in, what was it, 2011, we did a workshop on the contagion of violence with the Institute of Medicine and the National Research Council. And that was the first full paper that I wrote, that violence is a contagious disease. And I went to a number of experts in epidemiology and infectious diseases, including John Mills and David Heyman. And I mean, very recognized people who had been chief of infectious diseases and so on. They said, Gary, don't call it infectious, but it is contagious. I said, well, why don't you want me to call it infectious? They said, because we don't want to treat it. And so, but there's no doubt about its contagiousness and it behaving as an epidemic. And in fact, there are well over 100 studies, and many of them are even in that Institute of Medicine book. You could look it up, Institute of Medicine, Slutkin, and you will see in the reference section, the contagion of family violence, the contagion of child abuse, the contagion of suicide, the contagion of mass shootings, the contagion of community violence. There's so much data on this. But what wasn't so absolutely clear, although I did write about it then, was how they cause each other. And I mean, just think about this one for a second. If you have been abused as a child, you are more likely to abuse your own child than people who are not. That makes no sense in any other way, because you should be the person who, that's the last thing you would do, because you know how horrible it was. But in fact, it's because you picked it up. You picked up, as Raul Guzman says, the script. The script, we have copying mechanisms in our brain. Those copying mechanisms do not know good from bad, right from wrong, safe from unsafe. They just copy. So there's no other explanation for that. I'll give you one more. People who are exposed to war, Israelis, Palestinians, for example, when they go home after the war, they're more likely to do violence against their spouse, against their children, in their community. In fact, 25% of mass shootings occur from veterans. So why would someone, who was shooting at his enemy, now but do violence to his wife or his children? Because of the contagion. I mean, if
In
you
terms
pick
of
up
your
flu
theory
and then you
of
bring it home,
violence being a contagious disease, you've already said that 85, maybe even higher percent of violence is done by men. Why?
yeah, I write about this in the End of Violence book too. There are some biological differences in brain structure, but I don't think that's it. And I write what those structures are. That I mean, a lot of what we've learned. Let me just place this in there. We learned through the microscope about how microbes are there. We've learned in the last 20 or 30 years through the fMRIs and other kinds of things as to how social pain works and how social reward works and how mirror neurons and things like this work. So we have an invisible science that the first few chapters of the book describe as well. So remind me what you just said about, you were just asking me about.
Why 85% of violence is committed
well,
by men?
I don't believe that the biology of this is the reason. Why? Because if you look at Japan or Iceland or like multiple countries in Europe or in Asia, they have men and they're not doing the violence. They're not doing the mass shootings. They're not doing violence in their home. They are, but it's like way, 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 way less. And I mean, there are even cultures that have transformed themselves from being violent to not so, even in some of Europe and even the story of Tibet. So, but what I'm saying is that men are more susceptible, but they require exposure and require susceptibility.
I mentioned The Plague earlier, this wonderful book by Camus, which presents science and scientists and doctors as being like, I guess, Sisyphus rolling a hill up a hill, rolling a stone up a hill and continually falling back down again. What is the role of non-scientists, Gary, in all this? There's a new movie this week featuring John Lennon and Yoko Ono, a famous concert from New York City. John Lennon, of course, very famous anti-violence activist, cultural figure. How do you see the role of many, many other anti-violence activists who aren't scientists in all this?
Yeah, we need you, because what is important about any epidemic process or any disease is to understand it. And I mean, this is like we had with AIDS. We needed we needed Hollywood, we needed figures to talk about it and to explain it and to get it out of moralism into, not necessarily into science, but into understanding it. So you knew how it spread by exposure, what kind of exposure, and what it isn't, just bad people, to what to do and what not to do. Punishment makes this worse. It aggravates it. But having someone to help cool you down, or for you to remove yourself from exposure, or to even just know that exposure can affect your mind, is part of the what to do, what not to do. So that is why we needed to understand COVID. What is this thing? Well, it's an invisible thing in the air. And, if you're outside, it's diluted. So there's an educational role. You don't have to call it whatever you want to call it, but to understand this, the reason that we had something at World Health that we call the stuck problem, but we also have it on the wards in medicine where someone isn't getting better. In World Health, we saw problems that weren't getting better. And the reason that they're not getting better is because we had the diagnosis wrong. So we need to, and the way out of it is to help people understand what it is, how it's spread, how it isn't, what to do, what not to do. And we also need some kind of specialists in a way, but we also need paraprofessionals who are specialists. So everyone should have violence interrupters or a violence interrupter program like Cure Violence or other community violence interventions in their neighborhood having to do with if there's violence in their community, that can also work on family violence. And there's all kinds of other systems that need to be put into place because you can't do everything yourself. So to advocate, right now, to advocate for community violence is very relevant because all of the funding that has helped drop this is being removed, as it is in other countries for other contagious diseases like AIDS and TB and so on. So we need the popular, you name it, musicians, podcasters such as yourself, voices to speak for violence being something that spreads, call it what you want, something that behaves in an epidemic form, and that it needs, and that it can be stopped with this approach. You can call it the Cure Violence approach, you can call it the community interruption approach. And the same is true for war. And some of there are, in Chapter 8, I mentioned 4 war scholars who began to talk about war as a contagious disease. And they even used terms like we should be working this as epidemiology. Someone I work with who was an assistant to 2 secretary generals of the United Nations saying we need this system in the UN. And these systems work, these systems for epidemic control. That's how child mortality was dropped. That's how we got rid of smallpox. That's how we have been dropping AIDS and TB and malaria, through global systems. The people who have set up those global systems are people whom several of them were mentors to me, or I learned from them or worked for them. The person who trained me at World Health this is Danielle Tarantola, who had eradicated smallpox from Bangladesh.
Gary, finally, let's say you get your way, and we all agree that violence is a contagious disease, and we cure it, we get rid of it.
Hard for you to say, but thanks. Good.
What does the world look like when there's no violence? Of course, Aldous Huxley wrote his Brave New World, which imagined, I guess, a world without violence, or most of the world where there was no violence, but people were heavily medicated. They were all on soma. What's the role of medication in a post-violent world? Do people need to be taking pills that stop them being violent, or can we cure ourselves of it and it will be anything but a brave new world?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, and also in that way. So I'm not talking about no violence. I'm talking about elimination. Not eradication, elimination, which means that it goes to this is a very specific definition. Actually, there's 2 overlapping definitions. It means going to such a low level that it's no longer a public health problem, and or that it goes to 0 for long periods at a time, as measles was in this country for the last 2 or 3 decades until recently. But what it means is that you have a system where when it begins to show up, or there's about to be a case, that you have the system that stops it. That's what happens, by the way, a lot of people wouldn't know, with plague. There's a case now and then, but it doesn't go anywhere because the health people know how to stop it from spreading. Same thing with Ebola in Uganda, which we don't hear about very much anymore. It shows up now and then in Uganda, but they recognize it. They have a system, health workers like violence interrupters, and they will cool it down. You might have a case or 2, but it won't go anywhere. And that's what happens in a lot of communities now, in Chicago, in Baltimore, in New York. I remember being in Cherry Hill when they had 450 days without a shooting or killing. Very, very dangerous place before that. And they were now a year and a half. Now, there have been times when they've gone 3 years, and other communities have gone 3 years. But if you talk to the people who are there, the violence interrupters and the program staff, they're still working. They're working. They're still talking to people, making sure everybody is cool. If anybody's thinking about it, they're talking with them and keeping it cool. It's a little bit like a fire department, but I don't always like to make that analogy. But you have
we don't all need to be on anti-violence medicine.
No way. This is not behavior change. We dropped the rates of HIV in Uganda 85%. This was the most infected country in the world at that time. This was in 87 when actually we found out that a third of the population had 100% lethal disease. All that 85% change happened with behavior change alone, no medicines. Same thing for Ebola. TB was dropping like crazy long before we had a medication, when it got understood, when it got re-understood as a contagious problem. So behavior change alone, with the right interventions, with the right people doing the right interventions, is where we get to and have shown that we can get to, being able to drop this 80%, 90% into zero for extended period of times. Not that someone won't get angry, not that someone won't think about it, but that there's a system in place that is not a punitive system. It's a system that knows how to interact with people to deal with what they're dealing with.
Well, there you have it. Fascinating new book, The End of Violence. It comes with a lot of support from people like Steven Pinker, Nicholas Christoph. It's out now. It's an attempt by its author, Gary Slutkin, MD, to eliminate the world's most dangerous epidemic. And I wish you all the luck in the world, Gary, convincing everyone that violence is indeed a contagious disease. And if it is, we can get rid of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Hi, this is Andrew again. Thank you so much for listening or watching the show. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. We're on Substack, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all the platforms. And I'd be very curious as to your comments as well on what you think of the show, how it can be improved, and the kinds of guests that you would enjoy hearing or listening to in future. Thank you again.